Hey there, Prof. Aram here, and in this video I'm going to go over the concept of internal rate of return as one of the most important project valuation techniques we will have in the business. In finding the internal rate of return, we try to look for a single rate of return that summarizes the merits of the project. And it's internal in a sense that we only need the cash flows of the project, what it costs today, and what are the cash flows in the future years. Nothing else. That's all the information you need. You do not have to go look for the rates offered by other parties. All you need to calculate the internal rate of return is the cost of the project today and your estimated cash flows for the project. And as you will see, this is one of the most important alternatives to NPV, and it's often used in practice because it's intuitively appealing. Why? Because management and most investors often have much better feeling of percentage rates of return. So they think about rate of return, not the dollar amount. And because of that, this method is very appealing. So when you look at the NPVs of different projects, if you don't have a good idea about the different sizes of the projects or different initial expenditures of the projects, those dollar amounts might not be very informative. But when you look at the rate of return of your investment, simply by looking at the cost and the future cash flows of the project, that's actually very appealing. And alternative to this, I don't know if you remember, similar to this was the yield to maturity of a bond. We did the same thing over there. We just looked at the cash flows of a bond and calculated the rate of return for those cash flows. Now, how do we find this? So formally, internal rate of return, or IRR, is the rate of return that makes the present value of the future cash flows equal to the cost of the project, or it's the rate that makes the NPV equal to zero. So the decision rule here is that we are going to accept a project if the IRR is greater than the required rate of return for a firm. And it's common sense. If it costs you 8% to raise money for your firm, you shouldn't invest that money in a project that returns less than 8%. Let's see how can we calculate this. Before the modern technologies, we had to do the trial and error. So the way we used to do this was we picked a guess for the rate of return and then calculated the NPV. So, for example, if we have a project that costs $100 today and pays $60 in the next 2 years. So, the starting point, here are some numbers here. If the discount rate is 0, of course, the NPV of the project would be $20. At 5%, the NPV would be 11.56%. At 10%, you'll have 413. So what we used to do, we just picked these numbers and calculated the NPVs. So again, let's say at 10%, we find the NPV to be 413. We haven't reached NPV of 0 yet. So I'm just going to go to 15%. At 15%, the NPV is negative 2.46, right? So it's too high. I have to go down again. So somewhere between 10 and 15. So you keep doing this until you get to a point that the NPV of the project using the rate that you choose would be the closest to 0. So that's when we had to do the trial and error. Of course, nowadays we have access to the financial calculators and we can calculate the IRR very easily. Going back to the original cash flows that we had, $165,000 cost of the project today, and cash flows from year to year 3 are these. So let's use the BA2 Plus financial calculator first. I've already have these cash flows in my cash flow function. Cash flow 0 is negative 165. Cash flow 1 is 63, 120, and so on and so forth. All you need to do here is just push this IRR button and then compute. When you do this, you'll get 16.13% for the IRR of the project. And then in Excel, IRR is going to be the values of the cash flow. So you start from 0 to year n. Then if you want, you can enter a guess, but we don't need that here. You see that the IRR is the same as the one we found in using the financial calculator. So let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of IRR. So is it a good decision rule or decision criteria? Does it consider all the cash flows of the project? The answer is yes. And the IRR rule also accounts for time value of money because you're technically finding the present value of the future cash flows and comparing that with the cost of the project today. So we are using time value of money. Does it account for the risk of the cash flows? The answer is yes. The IRR rule accounts for the risk of the cash flows because you compare it to the required rate of return, which is determined by the risk of the project. Sorry, I forgot to mention this. So the decision rule in the IRR is to accept a project if the IRR is greater than required rate of return for the firm. So in this case, since the required rate of return is 12% and the IRR is 16.13%, greater than 12%, so it's good and we should accept the project. And finally, does the IRR rule provide an indication about the increase in the value of the firm? And the answer is yes, because we will always increase value if we earn a return greater than our required rate of return. Now, should we consider IRR rule as our primary decision rule? And the answer is no, because as we will see in the future videos, there are some shortcomings when it comes to IRR. And most of the time, the IRR rule is going to give you the same answer as the NPV rule, but there are few occasions that IRR rule and NPV rule might disagree. And because of that, we cannot really use IRR in all the occasions. So that's why we still prefer NPV as our primary decision rule. So I hope you find this video useful, and thanks for watching.